Hello, everybody. Welcome again to Storytime from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. The story we have for you today comes from Romania, and it's about a young woman who did everything she could to help her family. This is the story of Mizilca. Once long ago, there was a knight. He was rather an old knight. He had 3 daughters, all grown up and all quite beautiful. But he didn't really have a whole lot of money. The one thing he did have a little bit of knowledge of magic. He was a little bit of a sorcerer himself. Well, one day, he received a summons from the Sultan of the land. Every family was to send their knight to the Sultan to serve him for a year and a day. Every lord had to come, and if the lord could not come himself, then he would have to send his son. And if he did not send either of them, then he would be chased down and beheaded, and his lands would be taken from him, and his family would have nothing to live on. Well, the old knight, as we have established, was rather old and not in the best of health. And he had no sons. And so he began to worry about what he could do to satisfy the Sultan's requirements. And he worried about it so much that I'm afraid he made himself sick. And so as he lay in his bed, his oldest daughter Stanuta came to him, and Stanuta said, "Father, whatever could be the problem? Your face is so hot and dry, you have a fever. What is wrong? Why are you getting so sick?" Well, the old knight did not wish to tell her, but she pestered him enough that he finally gave in, and he told her about the Sultan's orders. Well, then Stanuta said, "Father, I have the perfect solution. I will cut my hair so that it is short like a man's, and I will dress myself as a man, and I will ride astride a horse like a man, and I will go and serve in your place in the Sultan's army." Well, the old knight did not wish his daughter to do that. First of all, army life was very hard and dangerous, and he didn't think she was strong enough for it. And second of all, the Sultan was known throughout the land to be a man who very much enjoyed beautiful women, and he was afraid that his daughter would not be able to return to him at the end of her service, that she would not be able to keep her identity hidden for that long. For a year and a day, that would be very, very difficult. And so the old knight argued against it, but Stanuta was resolved, and eventually, just to get some peace, her father had to agree. And so she went to her maids, and her maids cut her hair short like a man's, and they dressed her in man's clothing. And her father gave her the best horse he could spare, and a good sword, and a good lance. And he said goodbye to her, waving goodbye to her at the gate. But then he did something rather odd. Rather than going back into the castle and lying down, he disappeared across the fields, running off into the distance. In fact, what he was doing was running to the very edge of his lands. There was a bridge there near the woods, and he knew that would be a good place to do what he wanted to do. When he got there, he waved his hands in a certain way, and he said a few magical words. And suddenly, the old knight was no longer standing there. Instead, there was a large blue boar, a big pig with tusks. Well, before too long, Stanuta came riding down the road, and suddenly there in front of her, jumping out from the woods, was a huge blue boar. He was snorting and he was pawing at the earth, and there was smoke coming from his nose. Well, Stanuta's horse would have stood its ground. Unfortunately, Stanuta did not have the courage to face that giant blue boar. It was terrifying looking. She screamed and she pulled on the horse's reins, and she turned the horse around and she rode home as fast as she could go. In fact, she rode home so fast that the poor old knight had to really run as fast as he could go to beat her there. and he was so worn out at the end of that long run that he lay in his bed for a week, feeling very sick indeed. Well, at the end of the week, his second daughter, Roxana, came to him, and she said, "Father, your face is so hot and dry. You have a fever. Whatever could be wrong?" And he told her why he was so tired and so sick and so worried, because the Sultan was going to send someone to behead him and throw them all out of the house if he did not go and serve in the Sultan's army, and he just wasn't young and strong enough for that anymore. Well, Roxana said the same thing her sister had. "Cut my hair, dress me in men's clothes, and I will go serve the Sultan." The old knight did not want Roxana to go any more than he had wanted Stanuta to go, but Roxana insisted, and so eventually her maids cut her hair and dressed her in men's clothes and put her up on a horse, and her father gave her a good sword and a good lance, and he sent her off down the road. And as soon as she was gone, off he went across the fields to the same bridge, where he waved his hands and said some words and turned himself into a huge red lion. And as Roxana trotted down the road towards the bridge, suddenly there in front of her was a huge red lion, roaring and growling and scoring the earth with his claws. And Roxana's courage was not strong enough for that, and so she screamed and turned the horse about and rode home. And her father had to run so fast to beat her home that he had to lay for another week in his bed, completely exhausted. Well, when that week was up, his youngest daughter, Mizilca — now, mothers and fathers are not supposed to have favorite children, but the old knight, if pressed, would admit that he favored Mizilca a little bit over her two sisters. She was a little more bold and a little more strong and a little more something. He wasn't really sure what. So Mizilca came to see her father, and she said, "Father, you have not been well for quite some time, and I'm very worried about you. Whatever could be the matter?" And so the old knight told her. And as her sisters had done, she wanted to cut her hair and dress herself in men's clothes and go and serve in his place. And he said, Mizilca, your sisters are so much bigger and stronger than you are, and older too, and that they could not do it. I do not think you should, my dear. And really, please, do not cut your hair. It is so beautiful." "Father, I will not fail. Neither lion nor boar shall stop me. And even if I cut my hair now, it will grow back. It's only for a year and a day. At the end of that time, I will come back to you, Father, and I will have brought you the honor that serving in the Sultan's army will bring to the family." So eventually the old knight had to give in, and Mizilca's maids cut her hair, and they dressed her in men's clothes, and they brought her down to the courtyard. Now, unfortunately, the horses that her sisters had ridden were so terrified by their experience with the lion and the boar that they could not be used for war anymore. And so the only horse that her father had left was an old one that had been pulling the plow in the fields for several years. So she knew that it was not the best, but that it was the best her father could do. And so Mizilca climbed up on the horse, and he gave her the best sword he could, which was not a very good one anymore, and the best lance that he could, which was not a very good one anymore, and he let her go. And as soon as Mizilca rode off on her old horse, her father ran off across the fields, and when he reached the bridge at the edge of his lands, he waved his hands and he said his words, and he turned into a green dragon. Well, as Mizilca was riding down the road, suddenly there in front of her was a green dragon spitting a little bit of fire and breathing smoke. Well, Mizilca, she had a bit more courage than her sisters. For all, she was not as old or as strong or as brave as they were. And rather than screaming and riding away, she lowered the lance that she had, and she clapped her heels onto the side of her horse, and she began to gallop for that dragon, getting ready to pierce his heart with her lance. Well, of course, she didn't know that the dragon was her father, and of course the dragon that was her father did not want to actually be killed, and so he ran off into the woods, and Mizilca continued on her way. When she arrived at the Sultan's home, she reported to the Sultan, and she told him that she had come to take her father's place. The Sultan said, "Very well then," and he checked the family off of his list of soldiers that had to come and serve him. But he was thinking to himself that he didn't remember that particular old knight having a son. And the more he watched Mizilca as she moved about the room and greeted some of the other young men there, the more he thought that she did not look like a man, but rather like a woman. For the Sultan knew what men were like and what women were like, and there was just something about this new recruit. But he wasn't entirely sure. And he didn't really know how to find out. And he didn't want to say anything in case he was wrong. He didn't want to insult anyone. And so he simply welcomed Mizilca into the company of his knights. And he sat back and he watched. And as the days passed and the weeks passed, the Sultan watched Mizilca, and he could see that Mizilca was as good with the sword as any of his knights. And Mizilca was as good with the lance as any of his knights. And when they took the knights to the archery grounds, Mizilca was as good with the bow and arrow as any of the knights. But still, there was just something about this knight. Mizilca, the Sultan just wasn't sure if Mizilca was a man or a woman, and it was really starting to bother him. And so one day, as he was sitting at his supper with his mother, he was sighing and he was frowning a lot, and his mother finally said to him, "My son, what is wrong? Something is clearly wrong. You are sighing a lot, you are frowning a lot. What is wrong?" And he told her all about the knight that he had. Mizilca was a very good fighter and a very good shot, but he just wasn't sure if Mizilca was a man or a woman. And it was really bothering him. Well, rather than tell him that it didn't matter if Mizilca was a man or a woman, for Mizilca was a good fighter, and that was why Mizilca was there, Mizilca's mother smiled a little smile, and she said, "Do not worry about it, my dear. It is the easiest thing in the world. Bring in the merchants. Have them line one whole side of the great hall with the most beautiful embroidered cloths and silks and fine veils and delicate laces, and then bring in the armorers and have them line the other side of the hall with two-handed swords and maces and bows and lances and daggers and all sorts of armaments, and then call your knights into the room. If the knight you are thinking of is a maid, is a woman, then she will go to all of the beautiful clothes and the beautiful cloth on the walls. But if Mizilca is a man, then Mizilca will go to all of the armaments on the other wall." Well, the Sultan thought that sounded like a very good way to figure out if Mizilca was a man or a woman. And so he did as she said. The cloth merchants came in and spread out the most beautiful cloths and veils and laces and all sorts of beautiful things all along the one side of the wall. It was so colorful. And on the other wall, the armorers brought in all of the swords and the lances and the axes and the maces and all of the armaments. Well, as soon as Mizilca walked into the room with the other knights, she had a feeling this was a little something of a test, for she had noticed that the Sultan seemed to be watching her a little more than everyone else. And so she ignored all of the beautiful cloth on the one wall and went over and paid much more attention to all of the armaments and the swords and the knives and the things on the other wall. Well, the Sultan was not satisfied. He still wasn't sure Mizilca was a man. And so he went back to his mother and he said, "Mother, it didn't work. It didn't work. Mizilca went straight to the armaments, and I'm just not sure. There's nothing easier, my dear. We can do another test. Perhaps we have a grand feast, and we serve kasha, and in amongst all of the buckwheat grains that make up the kasha, put in a spoonful of pearls. Make sure there are pearls mixed in, and if Mizilca is a woman, then she will pick out the pearls and she will save them, for pearls are very precious. But if Mizilca is a man, then he will throw the pearls away because they will mean nothing to him. And so the Sultan thought that sounded a good plan, and so he did as his mother had suggested. He summoned all of his knights to a grand feast, and the first course that came out was great bowls of kasha with pearls mixed into the buckwheat. Well, Mizilca again suspected, for she could see that the Sultan was watching her rather closely. She thought this might be another test. And so she picked the pearls out of her bowl and threw them under the table as though they were nothing more than pebbles. The Sultan was still not happy. He couldn't prove one way or another if Mizilca was a woman or a man, and it was really starting to bother him. So again he went to his mother and he asked her advice. And she said, "Oh, it's so easy, my son. The last test. Scatter dried peas on the floor in the great hall and call all of your knights in. Women walk lightly, and the peas will just scatter underneath her feet. But men walk strongly, step down firmly, and the peas will be crushed underneath their feet." The Sultan thought that sounded like it made sense, and so he ordered dried peas scattered all over the floor of the great hall. And then he called in his knights. Well, as soon as they started to walk in, you could hear the tromp and the crunch of the crushed dried peas under their feet. And as Mizilca came in, she saw all of those peas on the floor, and she had a pretty good idea that the Sultan was testing her yet again. And so she made certain that she stepped down firmly so that the peas were crushed under her feet instead of scattered across the floor under a light step. The Sultan was so angry that this third test didn't work, that the only thing he could do to make him feel a little bit better was banish his mother to her rooms for a month. She had said it would be easy, and it wasn't easy. But he realized that he needed to pay more attention to his duties and less attention to whether or not one of his knights was a man or a woman. And so he stopped trying to figure out if she was a man or a woman. And in time, the year of service came to an end. Finally, the day came when Mizilca was supposed to return home. She packed all of her things, she strapped them onto her old horse, and she said goodbye to all of the men that she had served with for that year and a day. And she mounted herself on the old horse, and she was about to ride out through the gate when suddenly the Sultan appeared. He had come to say goodbye to her himself. And he walked up to her and he said, "You have served me well, Mizilca. Your father's debt is paid, and the honor is given to your family from now on. But tell me something. I've been wondering this since the day you came. Are you a man or a woman?" Mizilca smiled. She did not answer, and she clapped her heels to her horse, and she began to ride out of the castle. When she got to the other side of the gate, she stopped and she turned about, and she opened her shirt so that her chest showed, and there was no longer a doubt in anyone's mind that she was not a man, but a woman. And she called back to the Sultan, "A maid has served you 1 full year, and yet you did not know her." And then she turned back and clapped heels to her horse and rode off toward home. And when she arrived home, her sisters and her father greeted her happily. And because of the honor that she had brought in serving the Sultan for a year and a day, her family and all of the people in the land about treated her with much more reverence and much more respect from that day to this. And that is the story of Mizilca from Romania. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back and join us again on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Central Time, when we'll have another story for you here from the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois. Bye, everybody.